So moving on in topic 3 of the preliminary course, the first major economic concept that we look at is known as the law of demand. Now, where you'll find this in your syllabus is right at the beginning. It's a fundamental concept, and what you are required to know is what is the law of demand, so it's a specific statement, and what is the difference between individual and market demand. And I'm going to add in another demand term known as aggregate demand that's really important for you to know in the HSC course. So what exactly is demand? We use it as a common term interchangeably, but the proper definition of demand is the quantity of a particular good and service that consumers are willing and able to buy at different prices during a particular period of time. So the important parts of this definition is the fact that it's the quantity of a particular good or service, and consumers are willing and able to buy it at different prices. So quantity and prices is the main interaction that we look at when it comes to demand, and you'll see that when we start to draw the demand curve. But essentially, if you want to put it in more simple terms, it is based on different prices, how much are people willing to buy of a certain good or service. So obviously, as things tend to get a bit more expensive, demand will change as they get cheaper. There's a whole range of factors that affect it, but demand in general just refers to how much of a particular good or service people are willing to buy. Now, when we look at individual demand, that individual that's been put in front of it is all about one specific person. So it is one person that we're looking at there, their specific demand for a particular good or service. So my individual demand may be different to your individual demand. If a cup costs $2, I might be willing to buy 20, but if that same cup costs $2, your individual demand might only be 10 cups. For a variety of factors. Maybe you already have lots of cups, or maybe you don't like the style, your taste or preferences is different. It just depends. So individual demand is subjective and it's personal. Then when we look at market demand, we are looking at a particular market. So when we look at a market, we're looking at a particular good or service, or we're looking at a particular industry, and it's the total quantities of everything within that market. So it's a specific good or service. So our example here could be the market for seafood, the seafood market. So what you would do is the market demand would be all the quantities that people would be willing to pay at different price points, that add it all together, and that would be the market demand for seafood. I would have my own individual demand for maybe prawns, but the market demand is for everything all together. And the last one is aggregate demand. Now, this is the one that's really important for the HSC course, and that refers to the total quantity demanded for all goods and services. So it's every single good or service produced in an economy combined together forms aggregate demand. The word aggregate actually means a combination of things. So for example, we take the demand of milk, the demand for education, the demand for computers, the demand for tissue boxes, the demand for toilet paper, whatever it is, and you add it all together. And there is a really strong link between aggregate demand and GDP, because if GDP is the value of all goods and services produced in an economy, if businesses decide how much they're going to produce, it's based on how much is going to be demanded. So there is a link here between production and demand, because businesses are only going to produce what is demanded of their good or service. Why would they produce extra? There's no point. So in that sense, we can then use aggregate demand as a term that connects to GDP, and we can use it when we're talking about economic growth or different concepts. So what is the specific law of demand? This is what you need to know exactly. The law of demand states that the quantity demanded by a consumer falls as the price rises. So in other words, as the price rises, demand for a specific good or service goes down. That makes perfect sense, logical sense. As something becomes more expensive, you're less inclined to buy it. And it's this law of demand that gives us this shape of the demand curve, which, if you can look at your maths, if you've done maths, you will know that this is a negative a downward sloping line, which means it has a negative gradient. So we can say that because of the law of demand, there is a negative causal relationship between the price of a good and the quantity demanded. So a positive, if we're looking at a positive relationship, that would mean that as the price goes up, then the quantity goes up. But we have a negative relationship because as the price goes up, the quantity actually goes down. So that's why we call it a negative. It's a downward sloping line. It has a negative gradient. And also when we talk about the law of demand, you can say the vice versa. So as the price falls, demand rises. Okay, so as the price falls, we have an increase in demand as well. And that makes sense. Obviously, as things become cheaper, people demand a greater quantity of that. Now, this major thing here, which you've never probably heard of before, says assuming ceteris paribus. So there are lots of assumptions that economists make, and this one, ceteris paribus, it's a Latin word, is really important for the law of demand. So let's look into that. So ceteris paribus is an economic assumption, and it isolates the relationship between two variables. So obviously there are many factors that influence decisions, that influence demand, that influence prices, but when you chuck in on the end this ceteris paribus assumption, you assume that based on what you've said, everything else has remained the same. None of the other factors are changing. It essentially is a Latin phrase that means other things being equal. So if we say that the price of something has risen and my demand for it decreases, we assume ceteris paribus. We don't assume that maybe my income has also gone down, or maybe my tastes and preferences are different. We assume that that's stayed the same. The only factor that's changed is price going down. So it just means that this is what we're saying, and just assume that everything else stays the same. Nothing has changed. There's no other factor that is impacting what we're talking about. And economists use this as a simplification tool to avoid situations where lots of different things could affect. And we do this to simplify economic concepts, which allow us to look at them more in depth and explore them. And then we later remove those assumptions and look at what could really happen in reality.